Hey everyone. Today I am going to talk to you about the difference between disbudding and dehorning, and then I'm going to talk about the three different methods of disbudding. Every now and then, someone isn't quite clear on the difference between the two, and they don't know the limitations of each one and how they're different. So, disbudding means removing the horn buds, killing the horn buds so that horns can never grow. Dehorning, on the other hand, means removing the horns. Now, there is a huge difference between those two things. And I think sometimes the water gets muddied here by the fact that some disbudding irons are labeled as dehorning irons. There is no way, if a goat has horns, that you can remove them with an iron. Um, Dehorning is removing horns, and that's a surgical procedure. It really should only be done by a vet, and some goats don't survive it because it's done under anesthesia. So once a goat has grown horns, then the goat needs to be anesthetized, and a goat needs to surgically remove those horns. Horns are part of the skull, they're not separate. And so when the horns are removed, you wind up with a hole in the skull, and it's open to the sinuses. And they don't like to stitch it up because they say it's more likely to get infected. And that's pretty typical with a lot of injuries and incisions and stuff with livestock. Castration, they don't like to stitch those up because they want them to drain so that they are less likely to get infected. So it's very hard to do a dehorning in the middle of summer because it attracts flies. And so if someone wants a goat dehorned, you really should do it in the middle of winter when flies are not a problem. Dehorning this is the one that a lot of people would say is definitely inhumane because it is a huge surgical procedure. And you really need to make a decision before you get goats, whether you want goats with horns or goats without horns. I've seen people think, oh, I'll just buy whatever goats I want. And then, oh, if the horns turn out to be a problem, we'll just get rid of them. It's not that easy. It's much, much easier to just disbud a goat when it is only a week old. Bucks can be done even a little bit before a week. Does can usually be done up to about 2 weeks. And disbudding just means that you are killing that horn bud so that the horns never grow. So if you look at the skull of a goat that was disbudded when it was a baby, it is just a smooth skull. If you look at a goat that has horns, if you look at the skull of a goat that has horns and it's dead, of course, then and you cut those horns off, you see there's holes into the sinuses. So there's a really huge difference in the skull of a goat that's been disbudded at birth and one that has not. So recently somebody was saying that they bought some goats and they were still trying to decide if they wanted to disbud them. And you cannot disbud a goat that is 3 or 4 months old and already has horns this long. There are no horn buds anymore. Those are horns. So that would mean you take them to a vet for a surgical procedure. They're anesthetized. The horns are cut off. Goats don't always do that well with anesthesia. So you really only want to put them under anesthesia when it's a life or death situation. The alternative to that is disbudding when goats are babies, and that is to kill the horn bud. And there are 2 ways kind of that you can do that. The one way that is most reliable is to use a disbudding iron that burns the horn bud so that it does not grow. In cattle, they use paste sometimes, and paste in cattle can work a lot better. I was told early on, do not try paste for baby goats. And I'm kind of a stubborn person and I decided to do it anyway. I'm like, well, I don't understand why. And it's basically whether you're using the paste or an iron, you're burning the horn bud so that it doesn't grow. If you use an iron, it is a few seconds, literally a few seconds. You burn for 3 or 4 seconds, and then you remove it, and you do that again until there's a copper ring where you were burning, and then you turn the disbudding iron to the side, and you burn on top of that until the middle of that horn bud is copper. If you don't do that final turn on the side like that, what happens is you get a goat can grow little teeny tiny horns out of the middle of the horn bud. I've seen that a time or two. And it looks very different, very interesting. So to get it complete, you need to actually burn the center so that the whole thing, it's not just a copper ring where the horn bud is, but it's a copper circle. In the middle of it is also copper colored. And that's how you want to do it to make sure that nothing grows. And even with bucks, you can sometimes still have some growth because of their testosterone, and their horn buds tend to be bigger. And so you need to burn a little bit bigger area around the outside perimeter to make sure that none of that grows. With bucks, what you can wind up with are scurs, scurs. And that is a little bit of horn growth. It's not real horns. Like we're going to be adding this video to a article that I'm going to write about disbudding. And if you, I recently sold a 3-month-old kid to somebody. They were doing a starter herd. They wanted all horn goats. And one of the kids was 3 months old. He had horns this long. Okay. We have a 3-month-old, a couple of 3-month-old bucklings that were disbudded at birth, and they have scurs, and they're like this. Now, I know sometimes I get emails or messages on social media from people who have a kid that's several months old, and they're worried that they're growing horns because they see some kind of horn growth and the kid is already several months old. And those are not horns. If they're several months old and you've got, like a little piece of horn growth like this, that would be scurs. If they're several months old and they were not ever disbudded, then they'd have horns this long already. They grow very, very fast in the first few months of life so that they have got some pretty decent horns pretty early on. So if you have a goat that was disbudded, I know when I was new, my first buckling, after having him for a few months, I was contacting my mentor in a panic and saying that he was growing horns and he was supposed to be disbudded. And she's like, no, he's not growing horns. Those are scurs. And I'm like, no, he's growing He's growing horns. Really? She's like, no, they're scurs. They don't start growing horns when they're several months old. And here's an interesting difference. A lot of people think cows and goats are really the same. We used to raise cattle for well over a dozen years, and we had Irish Dexters, some of which were polled. And we had a polled calf, or I'm sorry, she wasn't polled. We had a calf that we thought was polled for 5 or 6 months. And then she started growing horns. So this, what I am talking about is goats and goats only. I am not talking about cattle. And, if you know somebody who has cattle and they're telling you, oh yeah, they can start growing horns when they're several months old. That is true of cattle. I've seen that in cattle. I have never seen that in goats. Goats, if you don't disbud them, bucks, by the time they are like a month old, they're going to have little horns like this. And they are like little horns with little pencil points and everything. And like I said, they grow really fast. We sold one recently that was 3 months old and the horns were already like this long. And I'm going to include that in the article that I'm going to write too. Anyway, the paste, some people are like, well, can't you use paste? We did use paste when we had cattle very successfully. The thing about using paste for goats is that goats have a much thinner skull than cows. So with cattle, I've been told like there's no worries about using too much paste in cattle. They have such a thick skull. You put a big, huge dab on the horn bud and put duct tape over it for a few days and then pull the duct tape off and you've got a horn bud there. It's never going to grow into a horn. Goats, on the other hand, I've heard stories of goats blinding themselves or burning a hole in their mother's udder with the paste because you put the paste on their skull, and first of all, it's going to start to burn, so they're gonna, like, start rubbing their head on stuff, and so if you have a lot of paste, they could rub it into their eye, or if they go over to nurse on their mom, just before they nurse, they bop her udder like that with their head, and so they wind up getting that paste on her udder. That paste is lye, basically. It's the same thing as lye, and so it will burn through skin. I mean, it's meant to burn horn buds so that horns don't grow. So if you get that on an udder, you could burn a hole in the udder and wind up with a really ugly situation. Of course, if it gets into the kid's eye, if because he's rubbing his head on something because it hurts and he gets it into his eye, it could also cause a problem. Um, and we tried this once 19 years ago when we were new. And, we had heard that if you use too much, you could burn through a baby goat's skull because their skull is so much thinner than cattle. And so we basically decided, okay, we can do this. And so my husband and I thought we'll do one kid each. So we each held a kid, we put the paste on their head, and we each held them for half an hour before we wiped it off because that's what they say you're supposed to do with goats. The instructions for goats are very different than they are for cattle. So we tried that and it was awful. It was so much worse than disbudding with an iron. When you disbud with an iron, you have a kid that screams for a few seconds. When you disbud with paste, you have a kid that's screaming the whole time the paste is on its head. So we're holding these kids and they were screaming for half an hour, and then we wiped the paste off and it had like barely not even burned through the skin. And so that was when we said, okay, this is horrible. This was half an hour of screaming because they were obviously in pain, and it didn't even burn through the skin. Definitely did not do anything to the horn bud. And since I had done cattle successfully before, I knew what it looked like on the cattle when you had successfully used the paste. And I knew like this did not work. So we wiped the paste off and called that a fail, and then got a vet to show us how to disbud using a hot iron. One thing I'm going to mention briefly, it's probably been 7 or 8 years ago now since a study was published about using clove oil for disbudding. And there was even a Facebook group where people got this thing started, and it really looks like it does not work. And the problem is there's not enough information about how to do this. It was one study that was done. The people who did this study, study was done in the Middle East. The people who did this study went to the local market and bought cloves and made their own clove essential oil. When you see people online who've done this, there are people who claim that it worked, and then when people say that it didn't work for them, other people say, "Oh, that's because you used a poor quality oil." Honestly, people have used all different kinds of oils, different brands. Um, and then they get into nitpicking like, "Oh, well, you did it at the wrong angle," and things like this. There isn't any kind of information like that in the research, in that study that was done on it. So there really just is not any reliable information about how to actually do it, because in that study, it appeared to work. They basically did it on one horn, so you could compare the other side on the goat. So like one side had no horn and the other side did. And in that study, it appeared to work. But people who've tried it have had extremely mixed results. And then there was a vet. I was at a conference, probably been about 5 years ago now that I was at that conference. A vet who tried it, and it did not work for her. And in fact, a couple of kids died. And so they did necropsies of the kids that died. Um, and it looked like it was probably caused by the injection of the clove oil into their skull. So she gave us a lot more details on what she saw in the necropsy, which I don't remember all the details anymore, but I just remember hearing what her experience was and saying, nope, not going to do that. um, because it just sounded way too risky. So disbudding with an iron is definitely the easiest. It's the least stressful on the kids. It works the best. if you want goats without horns, please buy goats that have been disbudded when they were only a week or so old so that horns don't grow, because dehorning is a really horrible option. It's a surgical option, requires general anesthesia. A vet needs to do it, and not all goats survive because it's a surgical procedure. There's anesthesia, there's chance for infection, and all that kind of stuff. And you definitely can't do dehorning this time of year in most parts of North America because it's fly season. And so you'd have issues with maggots getting into the wound and doing what maggots do. So that's not a great option either. If you're watching this later and you've got any questions, feel free to leave in the comment section below and I'll get back to you. Thanks. Have a great day. If you've got any other questions you'd like me to address in a future Facebook Live or YouTube Live, feel free to post in the comment section below. Thanks. Bye.